Good afternoon. My name is David Lee, and I'm the Director of Education for the Dallas Historical Society. Founded in 1922, we collect, preserve, and exhibit the heritage of Dallas and Texas to educate and inspire present and future generations. For more information about the Dallas Historical Society and upcoming programs, please visit dallashistory.org. If you're an educator, please make sure you've signed the attendance form in the lobby and pick up your certificate after the lecture if you want CPE credit. Welcome to Texas Rangers and the service of the Seminole Scouts in Texas with Lee Young. Young was born in Del Rio, Texas, and served in the U.S. Navy after graduating from high school. While pursuing higher education, Young joined the Texas Department of Public Safety and served as a state trooper for 15 years. In 1988, Young was promoted to Texas Ranger, becoming the first known African-American black Seminole Ranger in the 20th century. He is the principal chief of the Absentee Seminole Tribe of Texas. Please join me in providing a warm welcome to Chief Lee Young to the Dallas Historical Society.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to speak to your group here today. As Lee there just mentioned, I was born and raised in South Texas. Was born in Del Rio and grew up in the small town of Bracketville and Del Rio. I'm going to talk today about the Seminoles, the Seminole Indians, and the Seminole Scouts here in Texas. I'm also going to talk just a bit about the Texas Rangers. Both organizations mean a lot to me. I became a Texas Ranger in 1988. For me, that fulfilled a lifelong dream of becoming a Texas Ranger. There's a photograph here of the Texas Ranger badge. I always like to mention that something that is very most unique about the Rangers, our badges are made from a 5 peso, a Mexican coin. It's a silver coin. It has a pretty high coin, or a pretty high silver content. And many, many years ago, Rangers decided, well, the first Rangers weren't even issued badges. And some decided to have their own badge made, and the decision was to have the badge made from a silver Mexican coin. So that's why we still carry on that tradition today. Our badges are made from this silver coin. And the next image there is the official seal of the Absentee Seminole Tribe of Texas. Often when we talk about Seminoles, most people, of course, here in Texas, most people will have some knowledge about the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. Well, the Seminoles are a lot more than just the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. Sure, they're the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, which was actually organized in 1866. It's the largest Seminole tribe in the country. Then there's the Seminole Tribe of Florida, which was organized as late as 1957. And at the same time, they organized the Miccosukee Tribe of Florida. I believe that the Seminole Tribe of Florida today still owns what is known as the Hard Rock Cafes. That's one of their major business ventures that they've got into several years ago. Next, I'm going to talk about the Seminole Wars. And yes, it was Seminole Wars. There was more than one. The first Seminole War began in 1817. It was a short war from 1817 to 1818. The Second Seminole War began in 1835, lasted to 1842. And the Third Seminole War was 1855 to 1858. Something that is most unique about the Seminole Wars is the Seminoles fought 3 wars with the U.S., and the U.S. never won. The Seminoles are undefeated. So that's one thing that the Seminoles still carry on today, there with a lot of pride, and say, well, we were never defeated. Sure, there was some breakup in the Seminole people there in the Florida Territory in the late 1830s. In the late 1830s, some were actually captured under a flag of truce. Can you imagine that now? During the time of the Second Seminole War, the U.S. raises a flag of truce, say, hey guys, let's stop fighting and come in and talk about it. Maybe we reach some kind of agreement. Well, they decided to do that. They came in, and the next thing you know, the Seminoles were captured and placed in chains and in prison. That's when they captured the great leader known as Osceola. Well, he was captured, placed into prison, and ultimately died there in the prison. The First Seminole War started when the U.S. forces invaded the Florida Territory. It wasn't really a decision to seek more land or build more for the U.S. It was a mission where they intended to try to capture blacks that lived in freedom there amongst the Seminoles. So that was the start of the war. The Second Seminole War, which began in the late 1830s, just continued that mission that the U.S. had to try to obtain or capture as many of these black people that they knew lived in the Florida Territory. I'm going to mention something about the Seminoles. Prior to the arrival of Europeans on this continent, there was no such tribe or Indian or native people known as Seminoles. The Seminoles became or were built from people who came from other native tribes throughout the Southeast, and they were trying to get away from the settlers, and they were trying to seek a safe place where they could live and raise their families. And so they would leave parts of the South and North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, and they would go far south as they could go, which wound up putting them in the Florida Territory. At that time, Florida was ruled by the Spaniards, and the Spaniards began to call these new people from the Southeast, they would call them Seminoles or Cimarrones. The Indians began to use the same term or the same word, and they would call them Seminole. In the Indian language, it became Seminole, which basically means that they were runaways. All the natives and the blacks that went into the Florida Territory during the late 1700s, they were all known as runaways. They were Cimarrones, as the Spaniards called them. And that's what built up the Seminole Nation, or the Seminole tribe of Florida, and eventually became, of course, the Seminole tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee, who are also part of that same group of people. What was unique about the Seminoles fighting there in the Seminole Wars of Florida? They originated the guerrilla tactics. They would lay in wait there in the swamps, the Everglades, wait for the troops to come in, and once they had them pretty well surrounded, they would come out, hit hard, quick, and then they would disappear back into the Everglades. They were the original warriors who invented the guerrilla tactics that became very famous later on. They're in many other wars. This is Osceola. Osceola was one of the very unique Seminole warriors during that particular time. He probably offered more resistance to the Seminoles being moved from their lands and moved to other parts of the country than any other leader during that particular time. So he became known for his fierceness and his manner of going into the war and into battle. That was pretty inspirational there at that time. During the Second Seminole War, the late 1830s, 1838, that's when a group of 400, 500, 600 Seminoles, including some black Seminoles, were captured under this so-called flag of truce. The thing that was unique about that time was our people, or my people, were brought in under a flag of truce. The commander of the soldiers there in the Florida Territory at that time was General Thomas Jessup. Now, General Thomas Jessup, he is known as the modern organizer of the quartermaster system in the United States Army. Prior to him becoming the leader of the troops in Florida, he was the Army quartermaster. He was appointed by Andrew Jackson, by President Jackson, to be the leader of the troops in Florida. So he goes to Florida, and during the Second Seminole War, it didn't take him long to come to the decision that he makes the statement there. The Second Seminole War. He said, this is not an Indian war, this is a Negro war. What did he mean by that? Because of the number of black warriors his men were encountering on the battlefield. It was just not Seminoles or just native or just Indian people that they were fighting. They were also fighting black people. And where did these black people come from? They were blacks living in Florida. When the Spaniards commanded Florida, they had a policy. Anyone comes to Florida, you can have land. All you have to do is support the Spanish government in a conflict. The Spaniards, they probably were looking at the British as their major enemy, and so they figured that anyone that came to Florida could have land, and during the time of a conflict, during the time of a battle, you were expected to support the Spanish government. So a lot of these black people were, some had been born there in freedom, some were former slaves who had escaped from plantations in the South, and now they went to the Florida Territory, and now they were living in peace and freedom. And next thing you know, the start of the First Seminole War, there's people coming to capture you. The Second Seminole War is a continuation of that first war. There's still people trying to capture you. So that's why General Thomas Jessup made that statement, that this is a Negro war. And in 1838, when he had his troops raise the white flag of truce to have our people come in, our people at that time were commanded by a Seminole warrior. His name was John Horse. John Horse. So Jessup makes an agreement with John Horse and the other black Seminole. His name was Abraham. He makes an agreement with them. If your people will put down your arms here in Florida, stop fighting, and agree to move to the Indian Territory, you can live there in peace and freedom on your own land. So in 1838, General Thomas Jessup enacted the first proclamation of freeing slaves or freeing black people in the United States, far before the proclamation that actually freed people in the United States. That's General Thomas Jessup. Over the years, he became a pretty good friend of the Seminole. Our people took him up on his agreement that he made, and they agreed to move from the Indian Territory from Florida to the Indian Territory. This was the journey that our people were carried upon. This is known, I'm sure many of you have probably heard of the Trail of Tears. Well, this was our Trail of Tears. They would bring our people out of Florida, take them into Tampa, place them aboard a steamship there in Tampa Bay, and the steamship would sail the coast, the Gulf of Mexico, into the port and then from New Orleans they would then go by land up the river, up into the Arkansas Territory. From the Arkansas Territory, then they would go over to the Oklahoma Territory or the Indian Territory. But my people's journey didn't end there. Then in 1849, they didn't leave the Oklahoma, the Indian Territory, and they come across the Red River into Texas, and they go into Mexico, enter Mexico in 1850. So in around November of 1849, about 300 to 400 Seminoles, they depart from the Oklahoma Territory, and they travel to Mexico. Our people were led by John Horse, this warrior John Horse. Who was John Horse? Here's a little more information about John Horse. He was the son of a Seminole chief and a black woman. He was recognized as a Seminole warrior during the Second Seminole War. He spoke English, Spanish, and Muskogee. He was made a captain in the Mexican Army. He served as the translator for many of the Seminole chiefs. So in 1849, our people leave the Oklahoma Territory, embark upon approximately an 8-month journey. Some were on foot, some had some animal to ride or a wagon to ride in. I expect many were on foot. So on the 4th of July of 1850, that's when they crossed the Rio Grande in the southwest part of Kinney County here in Texas. They crossed the Rio Grande and entered into Mexico. Here's the timeline about some of the things I'm talking about here in John Horse. He was born in 1812. The first Seminole War began in 1817, the second Seminole War 1818. The Seminoles were moved to the Indian Territory in 1838. In 1842, the second Seminole War ends. 1849, when the Seminoles depart Indian Territory and travel towards Mexico. 1850 is when they enter Mexico. (1870) is when the Seminole Negro Indian Scout detachment is organized. 1882 is when John Horse dies in Mexico City. The Seminoles were led by a Seminole warrior. His English name was Wildcat. His Indian name was Coaquachi. He died in 1857 in a smallpox epidemic in Mexico. At that time, or shortly after that, many of the Seminoles then began to return to the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. But the black Seminoles remained there due to the fact that they still had a threat of being placed in slavery if they returned to the U.S. So they remained in Mexico at that time. These black Seminoles that lived in Mexico, when they entered Mexico in 1850, they had an agreement there with the Mexican government. They served as military colonists. What that meant, that they would protect the Mexican northern border from hostiles coming from north of the Rio Grande, entering Mexico and stealing and killing them, whatever they did. And so from 1850 to 1870, this is what the Seminoles did there for Mexico. In 1850, when they entered Mexico, a part of their agreement for them serving as military colonists was they would receive a grant of land. So they did receive a grant of land, which our people in Mexico still live on today. In Mexico, the Seminoles there are known as Mascogos. That's what the Mexicans began to call them when people first went to Mexico in 1850. They didn't call them Seminoles, they called them Mascogos. And we believe that name was derived from, because many of our people in the Seminoles spoke Muskogee. So they derived the name of them being called as Mascogos from the language that they spoke. Today, as I mentioned, they still live on the same reservation there in Mexico. It's known as Nacimiento. The complete name is Nacimiento de los Negros, birthplace of the black people. From 1850 to 1870, these Seminoles developed a reputation as being good scouts, trackers, warriors. So in 1870, when the U.S. is building up forts along the border and out in West Texas, they received some information about these Seminoles in Mexico who had been serving the Mexican government for 20 years. So in 1870, Major Bliss of the 25th U.S. Infantry sends Captain Perry down to Nacimiento, Mexico, to recruit some of these Seminoles to be scouts for the U.S. Army. And in the 1870s, when our people then began to come back into Texas. What's unique or good about this time is 1870, the Civil War was already over. The Civil War had ended, so now they had the opportunity to return to the United States to serve as scouts for the U.S. Army. So on July the 4th, 1870, there's another period of time in our history when July the 4th means a lot to us. July the 4th, 1850 is when our people crossed the Rio Grande into Mexico, into freedom. And why they did it they went into Mexico at that particular time was in Mexico where slavery had been outlawed. It had been outlawed by the President Portillo. Had been outlawed by the second president, Vicente Guerrero. He was of Mexican, African, and Indian descent. He was the president of Mexico, and he was of African, Mexican, and Indian descent. And he was the one that had the Mexican government outlaw slavery in 1829. So that's why our people were so inclined or had the desire to go into the country of Mexico, to leave the Indian Territory in 1849 to go into Mexico, because they knew that slavery had been outlawed there and they would be welcomed there. And they were welcomed there as military colonists by the Mexican government. John Horst, their leader, is made a captain in the Mexican Army. July the 4th, 1870, the Army organizes what they call the Seminole Negro Indian Scout Detachment. Their first fort, their first fort where they were established at was Fort Duncan at Eagle Pass. The first scouts quickly established themselves as fierce fighters, good scouts, good trackers. And from that reputation, they developed into one of the best fighting forces that the U.S. Army has ever seen. In 1881, the scouts were then, the scouts throughout their existence were commanded by white officers from the U.S. Army. The detachment always had a white officer that was in charge of the detachment. In 1881, the most known commander of this detachment was John Bullis. Bullis came quickly to realize that he had an extremely skilled fighting force there at his disposal, and he developed a connection there with the scouts. The scouts looked up to him and respected him to the utmost. It was not unusual for him to be invited into the scout camp for their events, the birth of a new child, So he was looked upon as more than just their commander. He was looked upon as an equal, as a person that they could depend upon and work with to have their goals carried through. This was the guidon that was used by the Scouts here in Texas. It was flown proudly anytime they went into battle or parades. One thing I will mention about the Scouts was the Scouts were organized in 1870 and served until 1914. During the early years of the Scouts, the early 1870s, 1880s, they were engaged in probably over 20 major engagements there with hostiles. They never lost a one man in battle. Never lost a man in battle. During this time of their service, 4 of the Scouts received the Medal of Honor. In this photograph here, you can see there's one of the Scouts received the Medal of Honor there, Isaac Payne. And there's my great-great-grandfather there, John Ward, who also received the Medal of Honor. As you look at these Scouts here, you'll notice Luz Casas, Antonio Sanchez, Enrique Ortiz, and all the other names here. Sure, they were called the Seminole Negro Indian Scout Detachment, but they were comprised of more than just Seminole Negroes. Some came from the Creek Nations, Cherokee, some were Lipans, some came from various Indian nations or tribes in Mexico, but the majority of them came from what was known as the Seminoles. Here's some other photographs of some of the Scouts. Scout Ben July. Here's another of the Scouts that received the Medal of Honor, Pompey Factor. Here it says that the Scouts established an encampment in what is today known as Big Bend National Park. They called it Neville Springs. This is what that encampment looks like today at Neville Springs there in Big Bend National Park. Three of the Scouts received their Medal of Honor on April the 25th, 1875. They were involved in an engagement where they had tracked a group of Comanches who had stolen some horses. They tracked them into northwest Valverde County, out west of Del Rio, along the Pecos River, at an area that is known as Eagle's Nest. And there they were engaged in a battle with these people, with these hostiles, and it didn't take them long. It was just bullets into 3 Scouts for them to be overtaken by these Comanches. So Bullis gives the order to the Scouts, let's make our way back to where we've got our horses tied and let's get out of here. So the Scouts and Lieutenant Bullish, they're making their way back to their horses. The scouts mount their horses and they're riding off. And John Ward, who is depicted here, at that time he was the sergeant of the scouts, he notices that Bullish's horse had ran off and left him. And so Ward gives the order to the other scouts, let's turn around and go back and pick up the lieutenant. And so they turn around, and now they're riding back into the battle, back into the gunfire. And Ward picks up Bullish, and he gets on the back of Ward's horse, and the other two scouts over here are trying to hold down the Comanches with gunfire. They say that as they're riding away, that one of the rounds goes through the reins of Ward's horse here, and that one of the reins shatters the stock on his carbine that's in the scabbard along his saddle there. But anyway, they all escaped. They managed to escape there safely, alive, and as a result of that, the three scouts who were John Ward, Pompey Factor, and Isaac Payne, the three scouts received the Medal of Honor for going back and rescuing their commander. These are the four scouts that received the Medal of Honor. John Ward, Pompey Factor, Isaac Payne, and the fourth scout that received the Medal of Honor was Adam Payne. He received the Medal of Honor during the time he was serving with Colonel Randall McKenzie in the Staked Plains War, which is up on the banks of the Red River. He received that in September of 1874. So these are the four scouts that received the Medal of Honor. And this is a picture of what the Medal of Honor that was issued back during the Indian Wars looks like. These are the headstones of John Ward, Isaac Payne, Pompey Factor, Adam Payne. I'm going to come back to Adam Payne here in a little bit and tell you an interesting story about him. Adam Payne was known as a very fierce and ferocious fighter, and he was well respected as a warrior. He receives the Medal of Honor, as I said, and years later on, he is killed when a deputy sheriff and a sheriff are attempting to arrest him because he's wanted. He gets into a fight with a soldier down in South Texas, and I believe he stabs the soldier, and then he escapes and comes back up to the Kinney County area, and the sheriff then has a warrant to go out and arrest him. The sheriff's deputy, who is working there with the sheriff, had also served in the military during the time of the Civil War. He had received the Medal of Honor. There, in the attempt to arrest Adam Payne and another Seminole, the deputy shoots and kills Adam Payne. What is most interesting and unique about that incident in our time in history is that that is the only known incident when one Medal of Honor recipient shoots and kills another Medal of Honor recipient. This is where they are buried. This is known as the Seminole Indian Scouts Cemetery. It's located in Kinney County, just southwest of the small town of Bracketville. It's been there since 1872. That's when the fort, or Fort Clark there, donated some land for the scouts at that time to be used as a cemetery for the scouts and their families. It's still in use today. It's what an old sign looked like back, that's probably from back in the 1950s or 1960s. But this is what it looks like today. It does have a marker. "1913. That's a detachment of the Scouts there at Fort Clark in 1913. What's unique about that is that just a few months following after that, 1914 is when the Scouts were disbanded. I'm going to jump back to 1870 when the Scouts were first organized. The first 10 Scouts that came over from Mexico, and they came into Fort Duncan to serve as Scouts. Supposedly there was an agreement made by that lieutenant that General Bliss had sent down to Mexico. He made an agreement there with the Seminoles. He said, if y'all agree to come back into Texas to serve the Army as Scouts, your people will be provided with land, and the Scouts will receive a salary, a monthly salary, for their service to the U.S. Army. So they come back. And the problem with that was that we don't know if that was actually a written agreement or not. To this day, there is no existence of a written agreement, but that was supposedly what the word was, that if you come back and you serve as Scouts, the Scouts will receive a monthly salary and your people will receive land to live upon. Okay. A part of that they thought was true. This is where they lived from 1872 to 1914. This is what some of the homes look like on the Fort Clark Reservation. This is what our people called the camp. And they lived there from 1872 to 1914. What happens in 1914? This is what is known as a Seminole Chickee. This is what the Seminoles live in Florida. And you can see the structure is kind of similar to what our people lived here in Fort Clark. So come 1914, when the U.S. Army decides they no longer have service or need of the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts, and the unit is now disbanded. This was the last. These are the last Scouts here. Their name is above each Scout here. But these were the last of the Scouts. And over here on the far right, Curly Jefferson. He was the last Scout to die, and he died in the believe the early or late 1960s is when he died, when he was the last surviving scout. The government informs the scouts there in 1914, your unit is being disbanded, and now you and your family are required to leave your reservation, and that the government has no other land for them. So in 1914, they depart. This is a monument there on Fort Clark to the Scouts. Seminole Negro Indian Scout Detachment, 1870 to 1914. Fort Clark's Honor Guard. Fathers, sons, and brothers served side by side, each new generation becoming scouts. Soldiering and scouting came naturally to these men whose quiet pride, dependable performance, and habitual courage made them perhaps the most distinguished auxiliary unit in the United States Army history. And here's a list of all the scouts that served there from 1870 to 1914. The ones that received the Medal of Honor are marked with a star. As I mentioned earlier, when we first started, the Absentee Seminole tribe of Texas. Absentee. We get that or come to that from being absent from the Oklahoma nation, absent from Florida. In 1838, when our people were forced to leave the Florida Territory and to relocate to the Indian Territory in 1838, under a so-called treaty agreement was made with General Thomas Jessup that we could live there in peace and freedom on our own land. Well, it didn't take them very long to inform our people after they arrived in the Indian Territory in 1838. Didn't take them very long to inform them that the agreement that they had made in Florida was not going to be accepted in the Indian Territory. So from 1838 to 1849, they went back and forth, back and forth. Our leader, John Horst, in the 1840s, he even goes as far as to travel to Washington, D.C. We're talking about the 1840s, and a black man travels across the U.S. How did he do it? He became an aide or an assistant to an Army officer. And that's how he got from Oklahoma, the Indian Territory, to Washington, D.C. His intention was to go to Washington, D.C. to have an audience with President Polk, to tell President Polk, hey, you guys need to honor the agreement that we made with General Thomas Jessup in 1838. He didn't really get to meet with President Polk. President Polk passed the assignment or the duty to his Attorney General, who was a southern plantation owner. Okay, he was a southern plantation owner, and the Attorney General's decision was General Thomas Jessup didn't have the authority to make that treaty in Florida. Okay, so John Horst turns around, he goes back, well, before he goes back, the officer that he had accompanied from the Indian Territory to Washington, D.C., he had originally agreed to pay John Horse a certain sum of money. And now they're in Washington, D.C., and he didn't want to pay him the money. And John Horse mentioned this to General Jessup. General Jessup says, well, that ain't right, and you need to talk to this guy over here, my friend, and he's an attorney. And so this attorney that represented John Horse takes this Army officer to the court, and John Horse wins the case in court and receives his pay. So John Horse goes on back to Oklahoma Territory, and it didn't take him long to come to the realization that he and his people can't live safely there. They can't live safely there. He had even gone as far, if you look into some of the history of the Seminole in Oklahoma, where they are today. The Seminole Nation in Oklahoma is headquartered in the city of Wewoka. What does Wewoka mean? It's a name in Muskogee that means barking waters. Have you ever gone out to a body or a small stream of water and heard the water kind of flowing over the rocks? Makes a little sound. Okay, that's barking water. Wewoka. Okay, today that's the capital for the Seminole Nation in Oklahoma, Wewoka. That town was organized in the late 1830s, or no, the early 1840s by John Horse as a community for the black Seminole. Today it's the capital for the Seminole Nation in Oklahoma. Getting back to the Absentee Seminole tribe. After the Civil War, when the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma made their new constitution, they reorganized in 1866, the Seminoles in Texas or Mexico were not welcome, were no longer welcome. During the Civil War, the Seminole Nation actually divided into two factions. One faction supported the Union, the other faction supported the Confederacy. After the Civil War, the faction that supported the Confederacy, they became the leaders of the Seminole Nation. And they didn't want the Seminoles that had left the Oklahoma Territory in 1849 and went to Mexico. Those people were no longer welcome. They were no longer welcome. There's only one case of one family going back to the Indian Territory, and they were never known to be listed on what is known as the Dawes Rolls because they were not welcome, so they weren't listed on the rolls. So our people remained in Mexico as Muskogos, or we remained in Texas as Seminoles. We were absent. Absentee Seminole Tribe of Texas, organized June the 18th, 2016. It consists of a tribal government consisting of 7 members, the principal chief, an assistant chief, and 5 tribal council members. We're organized pursuant to the Indian Reorganization Act of June 18, 1934. We're organized as 501c3. We receive no federal acknowledgement or resources. We're a nonprofit, 501c3 corporation. Oh, I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak to you here today.